As far as this paper is concerned, it addresses translation, or rather the absence of translation in Egypt, which in different ways is the construction of Greek culture and therefore may not be Egypt as it actually and authentically was. I consider the case of an investigation which occurs sometime in the 7th century by King Psammetichus I, Psammetic, but I don't know what Egyptian sounds like, into the priority of language in Book 2 of Herodotus's histories. The story thematizes the work as investigations, historiae, because it concerns a research, precisely a linguistic investigation, although the investigation, I suggest, is a failed one. Here, the Egyptian leader is interested in finding out which language is originary and foundational, and is therefore to be revered, because this ancient language, whichever it is, has an authority that Psammetichus wants to claim for himself. If he discovers the original, he owns the original language. The Egyptian king wants to assume the language into Egyptian culture, and so the foundational language must remain as it is, foundational. Egypt, through its leaders, highlights the other, and interestingly seeks improperly and incompletely to assimilate this other to itself by assuming the identity of what is foreign. In this way, Egypt, as we shall see, actually surrenders its authority. For Egyptian culture and language are mediated in such a manner that it becomes of less consequence than it might be. There is a sense that even in its own society, Egyptian has become a secondary language, taking a back seat to another, even older one. I look at the example of Psammetichus because it shows that a foreign language, when it is permitted to remain foreign, is clearly endowed with cultural and perhaps political power, which has the capacity to efface the current domestic culture and its language. So in Book 2, Chapter 2 of the Histories, Herodotus provides us with a scenario which has invited much prior discussion from individuals interested in the issue of language acquisition. For my purposes, the individuals interested in the scenario speaks quite distinctly and in interesting ways to the issue of translation, even though, and perhaps because, it avoids translation. The author presents the reader with Psammetichus, Psammetic, the Egyptian king, who was known for his experiments into the world around him. The ruler, for instance, had tried to determine the depth of the Nile by making a rope 1,000 fathoms long and releasing it into the springs of the river to determine its depths. So he just dropped it in like this. The rope did not reach the bottom, possibly waylaid by whirlpools and eddies, with the result that he concluded wrongly that the Nile was bottomless, and that's at 228. But the king also engaged in an important ethnographic investigation, and this is where language and translation become important concerns. Herodotus informed that before the reign of Psammetichus, the Egyptians regarded themselves as the most ancient people. King Psammetichus, however, engaged in what appears to be a task of Herodotean investigation or inquiry, historia, and sought to answer the question regarding the priority of the human race once and for all, wishing to know who were actually the first people. Hoitines genoea to protoi. He did this by taking 2 newborn infants from an ordinary family and giving them to a shepherd to bring up among his flocks, with no one uttering any words in their presence. His assumption clearly was that language is not learned through imitation and mimicry, but is instinctual and innate. The infants had no models of human speech and were thus to speak, if they did, without any precedents they could learn from. The children were essentially feral beings. As Deborah Guerra observes, Psammetichus's experiment involved one form or another or other of cruelty, whether to the children or to their mothers, from whom they are torn away. The infants were set apart in an isolated cottage, with the shepherd ensuring that they had enough milk to drink by bringing in goats so that there was sufficient for them. Accordingly, the children heard no words at all uttered in their presence, although they would have heard goats bleating. That's important. All this was done to find out what word the children would first utter when they had grown out of their babbling. Language was for Psammetichus the distinctive mark of priority, because it seemed to him knowledge of language was what one was innately born with rather than learned. And so, 2 years later, the children ran up to the shepherd and spoke the word bekos. The shepherd at first took no notice of this, but as the children kept on saying this word, bekos, 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 he eventually went and told Psammetichus what they had uttered. Psammetichus had the children brought to him and heard them utter bekos. Ancient authors did not regard this utterance as particularly intelligible, and amongst more contemporary scholars, like 1935 contemporary, Heidel notes that bekos resembles the bleating of goats. And here I play you the bleating of goats. Hang on, I have to, it's not working. Wait, it's coming. There's some people in it too, because the goats. Can you hear that? That's probably enough goats, yes? Enough goats bleating. Okay, so for them, bekos was not particularly significant, nor was it a human word, but the sound demonstrated that young children are affected by their immediate surroundings. In this case, the noise of animals they live with. If taken as human language, as the Egyptian king did, however, this was a word, and clearly it was not Egyptian. Herodotus tells us that Psammetichus, disregarding the notion that surroundings environment, here the bleating of goats, might affect the children's utterances, made inquiries as to where this word came from. In the course of his clearly mistaken inquiry, the king learns that it was the Phrygian word for bread. And he consequently concludes that Phrygian was the language prior to Egyptian, and so that the Phrygians were the first people. Psammetichus clearly regarded language as innate, rather than acquired by teaching or familiarization. It should be said, and it is generally not, that the logical conclusion which the Egyptian ruler must further draw is that the Egyptians were originally Phrygian. Herodotus is writing his narrative in the 5th century BCE. Possibly around this time, prior to 420 BCE, there is an anonymous text which perhaps responds to Psammetichus's view of language as innate, or at least proposes a contrasting view of language as learned and as acquired. This is the dissoi logoi. In chapter 6 of the work, the anonymous author proposes that we acquire language by offering the following scenario. If a newborn infant was sent off to Persia and did not hear any Greek, he would, as a consequence, speak Persian. While if a Persian baby was sent to Greece without hearing any Persian, he would, as a consequence, speak Greek. Custom and environment, rather than race or blood, are here understood as the basis of language acquisition. Language is not innate. One scholar, B.E. Stevens, may be concerned with identifying the sort of experiment undertaken by Psammetichus, linguistic or concerned with nature. But more to the point, again, is Deborah Guerra, who notes that the experiment is presented using the less vivid future condition, A and the optative in the protasis, and the optative and ka, the Dorian an, in the apodosis, suggesting that the scenario is hypothetical rather than that the babies in question were ideally sent to various foreign nations. Guerra also notes that Protagoras, in Plato's dialogue named for him, views language as learned from the community at large and not any one particular teacher. That's Protagoras 327b, 328d. Plato's Alcibiades similarly claims that he learned justice and how to speak Greek from his community at large rather than any one particular teacher. Herodotus informs us that he learned the story from the priests of Hephaestus at Memphis, although Hecataeus of Miletus, for instance, heard the same story in Egypt half a century earlier. The Greeks have other improbable versions of the story in which Psammetichus placed the babies in the care of women whose tongues he had cut out so that the children would hear no speech, so he's cruel. Sulek thinks that the narrative is Hellenic in origin because of the experimental inquiry that it involves. For my own concerns, this narrative is fascinating, precisely because it seeks a world without translation, with the Egyptian ruler attempting to discover and acknowledge the language in the world. The children are supposedly left deliberately unsocialized as if they live in a vacuum. There does not seem to be an attempt to bridge the prior Phrygian tongue and the current Egyptian one. One notes, incidentally, that neither of these languages was known to Herodotus, at least I don't think it was. Psammetichus only seeks to recover the origins of all language and to recognize it as such. In doing so, he is willing to cede the priority of Egyptian civilization to another culture, in this case, the older Phrygian one. The sense seems to be that cultures and languages are distinct and separate. This initially appears to be a narrative about non-translation, in that Psammetichus wants to discover the language which underlies all others to the disregard of later languages. Thomas Schneider observes that Egyptian culture avoided translation because this process would compromise the exercise of authority, since it destroyed the inherent ritual power of the language it was taking over. He observes that Egypt would render foreign texts without translating them, transferring them in their original state. Certainly under King Psammetichus's rule, Egypt is not a translating culture, and for this reason I suggest that it is actually and consequently a subordinate culture. It seeks out and takes the language of another society, Phrygia, as it is, and allows that other language to remain as it is in its own culture, as the foreign term bekos, rather than conveying it in its own language, namely Egyptian, one which is notably never heard in this narrative. I suggest that as a consequence of not engaging in translation, Egypt surrenders authority and is diminished in status and importance. Psammetichus, after all, seeks the culture which is prior, and if priority constitutes superiority, he therefore seeks the culture which is superior to his own. Furthermore, Egypt is made subordinate by in turn allowing itself to be translated. I wish to point out that translations have occurred at several points in this story. The first occurrence of one language being rendered into another is when Psammetichus learns that bekos is the Phrygian equivalent for bread. There is no apparent appearance of Egyptian in the story, and not having its language heard at all suggests that Egypt is culturally inferior not only to Phrygia, but also to Greek, inasmuch as a Greek narrator, Herodotus, is conveying this Greek narrative. Egyptian is incidental to the story, and in fact non-existent in it. Indeed, Herodotus as a whole implicitly translates this story from Egyptian into Greek so that bread, which is only heard as a supposedly Phrygian word, is the Hellenic artos in the text of the histories. Furthermore, Herodotus tells his audience that he's heard the story from the priest of Hephaestus at Memphis, an act requiring an implicit translation of the Egyptian into Greek. Yet one might ask, why they are priests of a Greek and not an Egyptian god?
No.
Sorry? Oh, that Herodotus makes inquiry of, particularly since the priests are at Memphis. There clearly has been some cultural interface between the Egyptians and the Greeks for Hellenic religion to have traveled to Egypt, but Herodotus evidently downplays any Egyptian influence. Overall, this narrative about the children proving the priority of the Phrygian language is a translation from Egyptian into Greek, with the Egyptian completely effaced. I observe that there are a series of unspoken hierarchies in this narrative. For Psammetichus, Phrygian, the language which provides us with bekos, is a primary language, and so is superior. For the Egyptian ruler, the age of the language makes the Phrygians prior to the Egyptians, who are thus the second oldest people. Herodotus maintains this hierarchy of languages and cultures. Furthermore, bekos is translated into Greek as bread and not into Egyptian by Herodotus, so that nowhere in the narrative is Egyptian directly heard. Herodotus speaks to the priests of Memphis at the priests of Hephaestus at Memphis and to people at Thebes and Hierapolis, that's 231. And we can imagine that the interaction in the first instance would have been in broken Greek, as the Egyptian priests had some knowledge of the language. This would indeed have constituted a cross-cultural exchange. Furthermore, there is a suggestion that Egyptian is the secondary and possibly inferior language with regard to Greek and with regard to Phrygian, whose priority has been established in this narrative. Even if Herodotus declares that the Greeks might utter foolish tales, ala te matai apolla, 2.5, and even if he takes the time to praise the Hieropolitans as the wisest, the logia tatoi of the Egyptians, 3.1, the fact that the Egyptian language is not heard does raise some questions about its status in this narrative, for it is effectively silenced in the story. The overall rendering of the whole narrative into Greek through the medium of Herodotus's work suggests this is the language and culture which has the ultimate authority. It is the case that even the chronologically prior Phrygian bekos is, after all, directly translated into the Hellenic tongue. Interesting. There is perhaps less than subtle parrying for status between the Egyptians and the Greeks in Herodotus' narrative. The author rejects the view that the Egyptians know much more about religion when he states that he was told about the Egyptian gods by the priests he spoke to at Memphis, and now refuses to relate this information on the basis that no nation knows more than any other about such matters. He observes, however, that the Egyptians are better at calculating the solar year by dividing it into 12 months of 30 days with 5 additional days intercalated, 224. The Egyptians also were the first to name the gods, which the Greeks took over from them and assigned altars, images, and temples to these deities. Thus, the Egyptians are the innovators in timekeeping and religion, having priority in these matters. But the overall sense is that this has now been subsumed into a Greek text, for Herodotus is now narrating and making over these details for a Hellenic audience. In the story, the two children and Psammetichus, the Phrygian word in the story of the two children and Psammetichus, the Phrygian word bekos is allowed to stand due to its temporal priority. But the fact is that the author, Herodotus, is Greek, and he offers the views and values of Greek culture. The story is fascinating because it shows that there are necessarily hierarchies where languages and their translations or non-translations are concerned. There is a jockeying for position between Egyptian and Greek culture, with the Hellenic coming out ahead because Herodotus is the author who controls the narrative. Phrygian may have priority throughout the story as the language, which precedes even Egyptian, but it is the case that the Phrygian word bekos is, however, rendered into Greek ton arton, suggesting an equivalence between this early culture and the contemporary culture of Greece. The court of Psammetichus provides only one small glimpse into the status of translation in Egypt, or perhaps it is more accurate to say the status of translation in Greece. If Herodotus demonstrates Psammetichus and his linguistic research rejecting the authority of the Egyptian language, it seems to be indicative of a North African approach to the other. Egypt worships the other. I suggest that the scholarly activities of the library in Hellenistic Alexandria 3 centuries later also reveal an antipathy to what is properly African or Egyptian. The location of the library itself constitutes an attempt to transform Egypt into a new Greece, one to take the place of the fallen Athenian Empire. Founded in 331 BCE, Alexandria was intended to become the refuge of what was to be regarded as authoritatively Greek. Translation was invariably from Egyptian into Greek rather than the other way around. And as Dennis Feeney notes, the Alexandrians were reluctant to translate other languages into Egyptian. So the Egyptian bureaucracy set about learning Greek so that they were bilingual. In the 3rd century, the Egyptian priest Manetho demonstrated the importance of Hellenic culture when he produced a history of Egypt in Greek, although this work has had no impact for Greek scholars and historians. The city of Alexandria was overwritten as a Greek text. Specifically, the letters of the Greek alphabet. Philo tells us the Egyptian city was divided into 5 precincts: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon. Callisthenes understood the lettered districts to be an etiological acronym commemorating Alexandria's foundation. Alexandros, Basileos, Genos, Dios, Ektisen. Alexander the king, offspring of Zeus, founded this. Just as Hellenistic poetry presented its readers with catesis or foundation myth poems, by its layout, the very city declares its own catesis to its inhabitants. The Greek king Alexander is the founder of Alexandria, after whom the city is in any case named, so that there is a Hellenic overlay of power, and as we shall see, culture in this otherwise Egyptian city. Alexandria is textualized as a Greek city. And accordingly, the establishment of the museum library was a transference, and therefore an overall translation of Greek culture into North Africa. Athenaeus informs his readers that the Ptolemies collected texts from the book trade conducted at Athens and Rhodes, Athenaeus 3b, while Galen says that Ptolemy copied all books which arrived at Alexandria by sea and had these copied texts inscribed with the phrase "from the ships." It is worth noting that the phrase "katatein oikomenein" had been a conventional way of referring to the inhabited world since Herodotus. And the use of it to define the provenance of the library's books suggests that in appropriating and acquiring texts, this institution defines the extent of political and cultural hegemony. Alexandria was the world, in other words. These texts are not translated, they are physically they're not translated, they're physically translated, merely taken over by the culture to become the native culture itself, so that the North Africa, which has adopted Greek elements, becomes a Hellenic world, at least at its elite level, which is its defining level. The Alexandrian Library grants the Greek language a preeminent status in the society. So Herodotus shows us something of an implicit inferiority complex where Egyptian culture was concerned. Psammetichus, certain that Egypt is not a prior nation, even though it is very old, but that it is eclipsed by another, sets about to discover which language was first and learns that it was Phrygian. In Herodotus's narrative, Phrygian is not translated into Egyptian, although it is rendered into Greek by the author. The languages that feature in the story suggest their importance to at least Herodotus, so that the non-translation of Egypt is as significant as the translation of Phrygian. In the Hellenic era, Egyptian was also subject to a far more deliberate and calculated effacement. Greek had become the ascendant language, where the elite Egyptian society was concerned. Speaking Greek and an ease with Hellenic culture defined one part of the Ptolemaic society that counted. One had to translate oneself into a Hellenic mode of being to be of any import and to distinguish oneself from the rabble. So Greek texts were amassed and deposited in Alexandria without any change to them. They were acquired rather than assimilated. Rendering one's language into another, especially one associated with a prior culture, effaced that translated culture and its significances. In the case of Psammetichus, the consequence of learning that bekos was the Phrygian word for bread, supposedly, led to a homage of Phrygian language and society, although as a Greek text, the histories achieves a prior status for Hellenic culture. I suggest that Herodotus' story about non-translation had the effect of suggesting the status of particular languages in the ancient world. Those which are heard, such as Phrygian or Greek in this narrative, were more powerful than those which are not, such as Egyptian in this narrative. And this has the purpose of suggesting, in turn, that certain language are just more powerful than other languages in the ancient world. Translation is, if nothing else, and it also concerns much more about hierarchy.